Dawn, 1944. A prisoner of war camp in Kansas wakes not to the usual roll call, but to a sound no one can name. It begins as a faint metallic vibration, echoing across the river valley, then deepens into the thunder of tank treads, a roar that rolls through the prairie like a storm. Guards shout, "Bridge test! Get down!" The German prisoners drop to the dirt, hands over their heads. They expect a collapse, a crash, an explosion of steel. But instead, there is silence. A heavy, trembling silence that makes them look up. From beyond the wire, a column of Sherman tanks grinds across a massive steel bridge spanning the Arkansas River. The structure bends but doesn't break. It groans but holds. The river below mirrors the machine's reflection, waves of power against the current. Among the prisoners, one man stays kneeling long after the others rise. His name is Otto Reinhardt, Wehrmacht engineer, former designer of pontoon bridges for the Blitzkrieg. His entire training told him that American steel was weak, their design crude, their bridges temporary toys of an industrial mob. Now he stares at something that defies everything he was taught. The sun cuts through the mist, glinting off the bridge like a line of light drawn by thousands of unseen hands, and a thought rises in him, quiet but unshakable. Maybe the world I believed in was built on the wrong foundation. They had been told American bridges would break, but the only thing that broke that morning was the myth of their own superiority. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because history connects us across every hour and every place. Otto Reinhardt had built bridges for conquest. In 1940, under the gray skies of the Rhine, his designs carried panzer divisions toward France. He believed in precision, in the idea that strength came from one brilliant mind, that a single genius could outthink 1,000 workers. That belief died slowly in captivity, not from defeat, but from observation. When Otto first saw the American bridge that held 100 tanks, what stunned him was not the scale of the steel. It was the texture of the work. The thousands of welds, each slightly different, made by hands that would never be named in any textbook. He traced the seams with his eyes and realized there was no signature of a master, only the rhythm of collective effort. He murmured to another prisoner beside him, "They built it like ants." The American guard standing nearby smiled, misunderstanding. "Ants are stronger than they look, huh?" That small comment would stay with Otto longer than any lecture. The U.S. engineers didn't glorify the individual. They glorified the process, the endless, tireless repetition that turned blueprints into steel, ideas into endurance. Every beam carried not a name but a number. Every rivet was recorded, every weld inspected, every mistake documented and fixed without shame. Otto had once supervised men terrified to admit errors, knowing one miscalculation could mean exile or worse. Here, he saw Americans correcting each other mid-task, laughing when they failed, improving with each attempt. In Germany, a single engineer was praised for genius. In America, 1,000 ordinary hands shared credit for the impossible. He later wrote in his hidden notebook, the one he kept under his bunk at Camp Concordia, "In our country, we believed a hero designed a bridge. In theirs, the bridge itself became the hero." That night, the prisoners could still hear the faint hum of the tanks retreating, the bridge echoing like a giant string stretched across the river. Otto lay awake, staring at the ceiling boards, realizing that the Americans had built more than a bridge. They had built a philosophy, one where greatness belonged to everyone willing to hold a torch, to lift a beam, to strike a spark. For the first time, he wondered whether democracy wasn't chaos at all, but order spread among millions of capable hands. The next morning, Otto Reinhardt stood near the fence as a group of American engineers adjusted measuring gauges along the bridge. The smell of oil and hot metal floated in the wind. He gathered courage and asked one of them, a red-haired man in dusty overalls named Sergeant Williams, why the structure looked so unnecessarily heavy. "Why use double the steel?" Otto asked through broken English. "Your load limit is far less." Williams wiped sweat from his forehead and grinned. "Because men make mistakes, bridges shouldn't." Otto didn't reply. The sentence struck him harder than any argument. In Germany, mistakes were punished, hidden, buried beneath paperwork. Here they were anticipated, built into the design. It was an admission of human imperfection, transformed into strength. He watched the Americans measure deflection again and again, recording every millimeter. They didn't trust the bridge blindly, nor did they fear it. Their philosophy was not faith in perfection, but faith in preparation. That afternoon, Otto walked back to the barracks with two fellow engineers, Karl Meissner and Franz Lenz. They whispered, afraid the guards might mock them, but unable to hold back the thought. "Did you hear what he said?" Karl muttered. "Bridges shouldn't make mistakes." Franz replied quietly, "Maybe that's why they win wars. Not because they are smarter, but because they allow for being human." In his notebook, Otto scribbled, "Precision is proud, prudence is humble, and humility may be the stronger metal." The more he observed, the more contradictions he faced. The Americans used excess material not because they were wasteful, but because they were patient. They worked slower in design so they could move faster in battle. Their so-called inefficiency was strategy. Their redundancy was security. Weeks passed. Each morning the clang of steel echoed across the compound. Otto began to time his steps to that rhythm, almost like a hymn. One evening, a Kansas sunset bled red across the sky. He saw William sitting on the bridge rail, drinking from a tin cup, looking at the water. Otto approached hesitantly and asked, "You trust this bridge, yes?" William smiled again, same easy confidence. "If it breaks, we'll build another. That's the difference, friend. We don't worship what we build. We learn from it." The German engineer turned away, unable to answer. For the first time, he saw that America's power was not just in its steel, but in its forgiveness. The capacity to fall, rebuild, and still call it progress. The experiment that made history began on a cloudless July afternoon. Heat shimmered over the Kansas plain, turning the river into a sheet of silver. Rows of spectators gathered, soldiers, engineers, and the prisoners themselves standing behind barbed wire. Across the bridge, 100 Sherman tanks lined up like metal beasts waiting for release. Otto Reinhardt's heart pounded as the signal flag rose. The first tank rumbled forward, then another and another. The bridge moaned, every joint alive with tension. The noise was deafening. Steel grinding against steel, the synchronized growl of engines echoing down the river valley. He expected the cables to snap, the supports to scream, the river to swallow the structure whole. But the bridge did not fail. Tank after tank rolled over it until the entire column was on the span, 100 in total, each weighing 30 tons. The American officers watched with folded arms. The soldiers joked. The bridge flexed, groaned, but never yielded. Beneath it, the Arkansas River carried the reflection of victory like molten light. A prisoner whispered, "It will break soon." Otto said nothing. He was listening to the rhythm of the steel. It wasn't the sound of collapse. It was the sound of trust. When the last tank reached the far bank, applause broke out among the American engineers. Even the guards clapped, some throwing their caps into the air. For them, it was a routine test. But for Otto, it was a revelation. He felt his knees weaken. His eyes burned. He wasn't watching arrogance. He was witnessing faith. Faith in work, in men, in the invisible bond between calculation and courage. Later that day, he was called to translate for an American captain named Reynolds, who explained that the demonstration wasn't a boast. "This," Reynolds said, pointing toward the bridge still humming in the heat, "is for the new recruits. We don't build bridges to impress. We build them so they trust what's beneath their feet." Otto nodded, speechless. That night, when the camp fell silent, he wrote one line on the margin of his notebook. "They test steel not to prove it strong, but to teach men that strength can be trusted." He closed the notebook and pressed it against his chest. For a long moment, he listened to the faint echo of that afternoon. The heartbeat of a bridge carrying not just tanks, but a lesson across a river and into the heart of a defeated man. By the 5th week of captivity, Otto Reinhardt had stopped calling Americans the enemy. He didn't say it aloud, not yet, but he felt it in the quiet between the hammer strikes and the easy laughter of men who built without fear. Every morning, when the whistle blew and the prisoners marched toward the river to assist the engineers, he found himself watching the Americans' faces. They were young, many no older than his own son back in Dresden. Yet they moved with a calm competence that came not from orders, but from mutual trust. One afternoon, a support beam cracked under testing. Otto tensed, expecting shouts and punishment. Instead, Sergeant Williams knelt, examined the joint, and said, "Well, that one didn't like the heat." Everyone laughed. Then, without panic, they replaced the section in under 30 minutes. The entire process, assess, correct, rebuild, unfolded with effortless discipline. That night, Otto told Karl and Franz, "They do not build perfect bridges. They build bridges that forgive imperfection." He began to see something Germany had missed, the beauty of simplicity. No over-engineered systems, no obsession with elegance, only reliability. Every component was standardized, every procedure repeatable. It wasn't genius in the sense he had been taught. It was genius in the sense of endurance. During another test, the bridge swayed slightly, making the entire group hold their breath. Otto whispered, "It moves." Captain Reynolds overheard and smiled. "Of course it does. Dead bridges die, living bridges breathe." Those words stayed with him. Back home, he had equated motion with weakness. Now he saw motion as resilience. The American bridge wasn't rigid. It adapted, flexed, absorbed stress. The realization unsettled him. It meant that true strength might lie in the capacity to bend without breaking. After supper, the German engineers gathered quietly near the fence, trading murmurs like confessions. "They build to last centuries," Franz said. Otto corrected him softly. "No, they build so the next man can build again." He couldn't sleep that night. Rain drummed lightly on the barrack roof, and the memory of the swaying bridge filled his mind. He wrote in his diary, "Perhaps genius is not invention. Perhaps it is the courage to repeat what works until it becomes art." And here lies a question for you, the listener. Have you ever met someone whose strength came not from brilliance, but from consistency? Whose quiet reliability held everything together while others chased perfection? Otto realized, in that Kansas rain, that America's secret was not its steel. It was its stubborn, ordinary persistence. The strength to keep building, even when no one was watching. That night, the air was heavy with rain. Thunder rolled far off over the prairie, the kind that makes windows hum and dogs hide. A guard's lantern swayed between the barracks as drops began to fall, hissing against the tin roof. The prisoners huddled inside, but Otto stayed near the small window. He saw a faint light by the river. Someone was still out there on the bridge. Through the mist, he could make out a figure climbing the truss, an American soldier, soaked to the bone, welding a joint that had cracked during the day's stress test. Sparks bloomed like fireflies in the darkness, reflecting off the wet steel. Each burst illuminated the man's face. Focused, uncomplaining, utterly absorbed in the task. Otto pressed his hand against the glass. "He's repairing at night?" he whispered. Karl shrugged. "Orders, maybe." But Otto shook his head. "No, pride." He watched as the soldier moved methodically, testing, adjusting, then lowering his torch, satisfied. There was no officer overseeing him, no audience to applaud. The bridge didn't belong to him, yet he treated it as if it did. For the first time, Otto saw not a soldier, but a craftsman. A man doing what he believed was right, simply because it was right. When the welding stopped, the soldier stood there for a moment, rainwater running down his helmet. He placed a hand on the beam, almost like a prayer, before walking away. Back in the barrack, Otto whispered to himself, "He works as I once worked, but he believes his labor serves others, not power." He sat on his bunk and began to write by the dim bulb above the door. "The enemy is not a man. The enemy is the idea that work must serve fear instead of hope." That single sentence filled him with something he hadn't felt in months. Dignity. Not pride in nation, but pride in profession. The next morning, the rain had cleared. The bridge gleamed under sunlight, every joint shining where new weld met old steel. Otto looked at it and knew the line between captor and captive had blurred. They were all engineers before they were enemies. Men whose hands remembered creation, even in the middle of destruction. He turned to Franz and said quietly, "We thought we built bridges to conquer. They build to connect." And for once, Franz had no answer. He simply looked down at his own calloused palms, wondering how many wars could have been avoided if hands like theirs had met sooner. Not across a battlefield, but across a blueprint. 2 decades later, the world had changed its flags, but not its rivers. In 1965, Otto Reinhardt stood before a class of civil engineering students at the University of Stuttgart. His hair was white now, his voice calm, the war a ghost that spoke only through memory. Behind him, projected on the wall, was a faded photograph, the Kansas Bridge, sunlight spilling across its steel ribs like liquid gold. The students watched as he tapped the image with a piece of chalk. "This bridge," he said softly, "was built by the people we once called enemies. It carried 100 tanks, and still it never broke." A young man raised his hand. "Professor, how did they make it so strong?" Otto smiled faintly. "By believing no man builds alone. Each rivet, each weld, belonged to a worker who trusted the next one. Strength," he paused, "is the mathematics of trust." He handed around his old notebook, the one he had hidden under his bunk at Camp Concordia. Its pages were yellow, corners curled, still smelling faintly of iron and tobacco. Inside was a note he had written that last week before liberation. "I no longer remember how many tanks crossed. I only remember the bridge never fell." When the lecture ended, students stayed behind to look at the photograph. Otto remained by the window, watching rain fall on the Neckar River, hearing in the distance the same hum he once heard in Kansas, the sound of water meeting steel, the language of endurance. He thought of Sergeant Williams, of Captain Reynolds, of the anonymous welder who worked through the storm. He never saw them again, but they lived in the symmetry of every bridge he designed after the war, not as ghosts, but as teachers. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the water. Otto took a slow breath and whispered to himself, "The men who build bridges win wars, not those who cross them." He left the lecture hall dark, except for the slides still glowing on the wall. The bridge arching into the horizon, solid and silent. And if you're still watching, ask yourself this. In your own life, are you the one crossing bridges, or the one building them for others to cross? Because history remembers the victors, but it's the builders who make victory possible. When wars end, the silence that follows is heavier than gunfire. It settles into the corners of memory, into the minds of men who once believed that steel and pride could hold a world together. For Otto Reinhardt and thousands like him, captivity in America was not just imprisonment, it was revelation. They came as conquerors and left as witnesses. Witnesses to a nation whose strength did not roar, but resonated quietly through every bridge, every machine, every handshake built on trust instead of fear. Years later, Otto would admit to himself that what he saw in Kansas was not just engineering, it was a philosophy in metal. Each weld represented cooperation, each joint symbolized equality, each beam carried the invisible weight of a moral truth, that real endurance comes from humility, from the courage to accept imperfection, from the refusal to worship one's own brilliance. He would walk across bridges in post-war Germany and feel the ghosts of that Kansas wind. He would pause at the rhythmic vibration under his feet, and it would remind him of the day when 100 tanks rolled over the river and nothing broke. The bridge became his quiet creed, that human hands, when joined in purpose, could bear more than any nation, any ideology, any war. Some of those bridges still stand today. The soldiers who built and tested them are gone, but their work endures, spanning rivers and generations alike. They remind us that progress is not born from domination, but from collaboration. The steel may rust, the photographs may fade, yet the lesson remains clear. We build not to conquer, but to connect. And perhaps, if we listen closely on a quiet evening, we can still hear that distant sound, the hum of a bridge carrying not tanks, but hope.